Right now, in the next 10 seconds, you are going to read a sequence of symbols that a merchant invented roughly 3,200 years ago. Not a king, not a priest, not an army. A merchant. He didn't build it to glorify a god or record a conquest. He built it because he was tired of memorizing 700 different signs just to write down how many goats he sold. That system is the reason you can read this sentence right now. It's the reason every language on this screen, English, Spanish, Russian, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, ultimately traces back to the same 22 symbols. And the people who invented it, they never conquered an empire. They never had a standing army worth mentioning. Rome erased their capital city so completely that for 2,000 years, historians weren't even sure where it stood. This is the story of the Phoenicians, and how a small group of traders on a strip of coastline you could drive across in an afternoon ended up embedded in literally every word you will ever write. To understand why this invention mattered, you need to see how broken writing was before it existed. By 1200 BCE, two civilizations had already been writing for over 1,000 years. The Egyptians had hieroglyphs, beautiful, monumental, carved into temple walls to last forever. The Mesopotamians had cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay. Here's the problem with both systems. They were built for scribes, not for everyone else. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing used hundreds of different symbols, some representing whole ideas, some representing sounds, and mastering it took years of formal training. Cuneiform was just as brutal. A student could spend a decade in scribal school before he was trusted to write a business contract. These weren't writing systems for the average person. They were professional credentials, deliberately complicated, controlled by priests and palace bureaucracies who had every incentive to keep literacy rare and powerful. Now, picture a Phoenician merchant standing on a dock in Byblos, on the coast of what's now Lebanon. He's not writing poetry for a temple wall. He needs to write 40 jars of wine, 12 cedar logs, paid in silver, receipt for a hiram. He needs to do this 50 times a day, in a hurry, often on a moving ship, often in a foreign port where nobody speaks his language. Hieroglyphs and cuneiform were built for permanence and prestige. Phoenician trade needed something built for speed. So, somewhere along the Levantine coast, historians still argue about exactly where and exactly who. Someone took an old idea that had been floating around Semitic-speaking scribes in Canaan for centuries and pushed it to its logical extreme. Here's the actual trick, and it's disarmingly simple. Instead of hundreds of symbols for words or syllables, use a small set of symbols, each one representing a single consonant sound. Nothing else. No pictures of gods, no symbols for entire concepts like kingship or eternity, just sounds. Roughly 22 of them. Watch what this does. With 22 symbols, combined in different orders, you can spell every word in your language. Compare that to Egyptian scribes memorizing several hundred hieroglyphic signs, some standing for whole words, some for sounds, some for both, depending on context. The Phoenician system could be taught to a teenager in weeks, not years. And they didn't invent these shapes from nothing. Many of the letters were simplified pictures. A stylized ox head became the letter that the Greeks would later call alpha. A house floor plan became beta. The Phoenicians took drawings and stripped them down until they were just fast, scratchable shapes. Something you could carve into stone with a chisel or scratch onto broken pottery with a stick in seconds, not minutes. There's one more detail that trips people up, so let's clear it up now. This alphabet had no vowels, only consonants. If you tried to write the English word cat in Phoenician-style script, it would look something like C-T, and the reader was expected to fill in the vowel sound from context, the same way you can usually read a text message without vowels and still understand it. This wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Semitic languages like Phoenician and Hebrew are built around consonant root patterns, so a skilled reader can reconstruct the missing vowels almost automatically, the same way you don't need every letter of a word to recognize it on a billboard doing 60 miles an hour. The result? A writing system so efficient that literacy stopped being a priesthood's monopoly. A Phoenician sailor could learn to read and write. So could a soldier. So could, eventually, a Greek trader who'd never even seen Egypt. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This alphabet spread faster and further than the Phoenician Navy or the Phoenician army ever did. because it didn't need conquest to travel. It needed trade. Phoenician ships were the delivery mechanism. Every port they touched, Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, the coast of what's now Tunisia, Spain, possibly further, got a small dose of this new technology, almost as a side effect of doing business. You didn't need to defeat a people to give them your alphabet. You just needed to sell them wine and cedar wood and purple cloth, and let your trading partners see how absurdly convenient your record-keeping was compared to theirs. The Greeks were the ones who took it furthest. Sometime around the 8th century BCE, Greek traders in contact with Phoenician merchants borrowed the system wholesale. Same letter shapes, similar names. Aleph, the Phoenician word for ox, became alpha. Bet, meaning house, became beta. Put those two names together, alpha, beta, and you get the word we still use today, alphabet. But the Greeks made one modification that changed everything again. Their language needed vowel sounds, distinguished clearly. So they took several Phoenician letters representing sounds that don't exist in Greek and repurposed them as vowels. That single adjustment, adding A, E, I, O, U, as their own dedicated symbols, is arguably the second biggest leap in the history of writing, and it happened as a byproduct of a trade relationship most people have never heard of. From Greek, the alphabet split into two great branches. One went east into Etruria, on the Italian peninsula, where a people called the Etruscans adopted and modified it, and passed it to Rome. Rome's version is, letter for letter, astonishingly close to the alphabet on your screen right now. The other branch went through Byzantium and became the Cyrillic script used across Russia and much of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the alphabet's other descendants moved in a completely different direction. Aramaic, a close cousin of Phoenician script used across the Near East, became the ancestor of Hebrew script and later, Arabic script. Even scripts used in India trace part of their ancestry back through Aramaic trade routes stretching toward Persia. Stop and take that in for a second. Latin, Cyrillic, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, 5 writing systems used by roughly 2/3 of the population on Earth today, all trace back to the same 22 consonant symbols scratched onto clay tablets and broken pottery by merchants on a coastline you could drive across in an afternoon. No empire in history conquered that much territory. An alphabet did, riding in the cargo hold of trading ships. So, who were the people behind all this? This is where it gets almost frustrating, because the honest answer is, we don't fully know, in their own words. The Phoenicians left behind almost no surviving literature of their own. No epics, no philosophy, no personal letters that survived in bulk. Nearly everything we know about them comes from what other civilizations wrote about them, plus what archaeologists have dug out of the ground. The Greeks wrote about them. The Egyptians wrote about them. The Hebrew Bible mentions them constantly. Cedar wood for Solomon's temple. King Hiram of Tyre as an ally. Later, the Romans wrote about them too. But the Romans had just spent over a century fighting 3 brutal wars against Carthage, the greatest Phoenician colony. So you can guess how flattering that account tends to be. Here's a useful way to picture Phoenicia itself. It was never one unified empire. It was a string of independent city-states along a coastline in what's now Lebanon. Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon were the most famous, and they were frequently rivals rather than allies. Think less Roman Empire and more a loose network of competing trading ports, similar to medieval Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, cooperating when profitable, competing when not, never unifying under one crown for any length of time. What made them extraordinary wasn't military conquest. It was logistics and craftsmanship. They were master shipbuilders and navigators, sailing further and more confidently than anyone else in the ancient Mediterranean. From around 1000 BCE, they built a seaborne trade empire that dominated much of the Mediterranean, using nothing but cedar-hulled ships, star navigation, and an absurd tolerance for risk. They exported cedar wood, the same wood used in Egyptian coffins and Solomon's temple. And they exported something even more valuable, a dye. A purple dye extracted from a small sea snail called the murex, so labor-intensive to produce that a single garment could cost more than a soldier's yearly wage. That purple became the color of emperors and kings for the next 2,000 years. The word purple itself, in several languages, ultimately traces back to the Greek word for this exact Phoenician product. As Phoenician trading posts multiplied across the Mediterranean, one of them, on the coast of North Africa, eventually grew larger and more powerful than the entire homeland that founded it. That colony was Carthage. According to legend, Carthage was founded by a Tyrian queen named Dido, who was said to have negotiated for land using nothing but an ox hide, then cut the hide into strips thin enough to encircle an entire hilltop. True or not, the story captures something real about how the Phoenicians operated: clever deal-making over brute force conquest. Carthage eventually became so wealthy and so dominant in Western Mediterranean trade that it stopped being a colony in any meaningful sense and became a rival superpower in its own right, one that would eventually fight Rome in 3 wars so devastating that they reshaped the ancient world. You already know the name of Carthage's most famous general, even if you've never once connected him to the word alphabet: Hannibal, who marched war elephants over the Alps to attack Rome directly on Italian soil. Rome won, eventually, and when Rome finally crushed Carthage for good in 146 BCE, they didn't just defeat the city. Ancient sources claim they leveled it so completely that the location of the original Phoenician settlement was debated by historians for centuries afterward. Here's the strange irony sitting underneath all of this. Rome erased the political power of the Phoenicians almost entirely. But Rome was writing the entire story of that destruction using an alphabet, passed to them through the Etruscans, that was, at its root, a Phoenician invention. The empire that destroyed Carthage was recording its own victory using the loser's technology. So why does any of this matter now, 3,000 years later? Because it's one of the cleanest examples in all of history of a simple truth. Military power and cultural power are not the same thing, and they don't always travel together. Rome's legions are gone. Carthage's walls are gone. The Phoenician language itself is dead. Nobody has spoken it as a native tongue in well over 1,000 years. But the letters survived everything. They survived the fall of Carthage, the fall of Rome, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the fall of every civilization that ever used them. They survived because an alphabet doesn't need an army to defend it. It just needs to be useful enough that the next civilization keeps copying it. Every time you write a text message, sign your name, or read a street sign, you are using a piece of technology built by traders who no longer have a country, whose language no longer has native speakers, and whose greatest city was demolished so thoroughly that we lost track of where it stood. That's not a small legacy. That might be the largest legacy in human history that almost nobody thinks about. The Phoenicians left almost no writing of their own explaining who they were, but they left something stranger buried outside Carthage, a burial ground called the Tophet, filled with the remains of children, and a controversy among archaeologists that's still unresolved today. Some historians call it hard evidence of ritual sacrifice. Others call it Roman propaganda that stuck for 2,000 years. That's next.